Good day, Brigade. This is Bahbi, and this week we're going to be coming at you with just a much simpler, much calmer issue. One that's not so immediately pressing. Well, actually, it is pretty pressing. Never mind on that one, but an issue that's not going to immediately just start a fire, you know? And the issue this week we're going to be covering is affordable housing, and we're also going to be discussing a bill that's on for at least our state in Colorado for affordable housing funding and things like that. Some pros, some cons, some things that we might want to take away, some things we might want to change, and all that. So that's basically what we're going to be covering this episode. Anyways, get a little fact for you. Did you know that a dime has 118 ridges around the edge? Now that one's actually a pretty well-known fun fact, but do you know why dimes and quarters have ridges but not nickels? And the answer to that is actually for the blind. It makes it much easier to determine coins from one another. Now the dime is easy enough to determine because it's small. However, quarters and nickels can get much more easily confused. As someone who digs his hands into pockets for coins often, I can tell you, yeah, they're pretty similar if you're just grabbing quickly. Which is why the smooth edge and the ridge edge exist on both the nickel and the quarter. Or rather, the nickel has the smooth edge and the quarter has the rough edge. Anyways, let's get on with our show. So, to start today, we're going to be discussing, well, what is affordable housing? Hopefully this one doesn't need too much discussion because those two words together should be pretty straightforward. It's housing that is affordable. Now, what exactly do we mean by affordable? Well, generally when people refer to affordable housing, they're referring to housing that's usually like $300,000 or under, something that's, within reason for the average American, or at least the average person within the particular jurisdiction, and in this case, the $300,000 threshold is usually a pretty good medium, especially for most middle-class Americans. And usually, it's not something super fancy or high-quality looking. It's kind of like housing that's built as kind of a start. Things that would be included in affordable housing would be like condos, townhomes, things like that. Now, many places like to take measures to either limit or promote affordable housing, and sadly this one falls on a political spectrum. For some odd reason, and honestly I can only chalk this up to old landowner resentments and all that, is that on the right, for some reason, affordable housing is frowned upon, rejected, and all sorts of things. God only knows why. I'm guessing because, affordable housing is just an extension of government funding and all that getting into the economy. That would be my best guess on it. But quite frankly, when you look at the numbers, you look at economics and all that, there really is no reason you shouldn't be promoting some form of affordable housing. I know we kind of just got to the point real quickly there on this one, but honestly, it's a polarized issue in the American Union when it really, really doesn't need to be. And really, really shouldn't be. Now, there's a movement that some of you might be familiar with called NIMBY. NIMBY, if you're unfamiliar, is an acronym for Not in My Backyard. Usually, this is the idea of trying to keep property values up. The problem with that is, if you want to keep property values up, you're going to be limiting the overall amount of affordable housing and the overall amount of whether or not people can enter that market in the first place. Now, you might be wondering why. Well, property values, pretty much exactly like land values, because property values are based in large part on the land value, have the tendency to go up rather than down. Now, the reason for this is because there's only a finite amount of property that exists that can be purchased. Property, in this case, basically just being land or land that has possibly been developed. So, you can see how this ties back into our own personal philosophies to begin with. But, going back to this is kind of why trying to increase property values and just continuously raise them is not a good thing. Yes, it makes sense that you'd want your investment, i.e. your property, to go up in value. However, using land and property as an investment is fundamentally flawed due to the fact that, again, we're talking about something that's a fixed supply, thus its value will go up just as population increases and demand for land, for housing, and all that grows even further. So you might be wondering at this point, well, wouldn't lowering property values also be bad? And arguably, yes. It also would be bad to do it that way because, well, that'd just be economic sabotage. So, why do we need to limit the idea of NIMBY here? Well, because if we're limiting whether or not things can be built anywhere where we want them or where we need them in the preservation of property values, then we're limiting our ability to actually build, grow, and develop as society. Now, many people might argue that, oh, we don't need to keep continuously developing things. And in a way, you're right. But at the same time, there still needs to be a minimal level of continuous development in order to satisfy and deal with an ever-increasing growing populace. And no matter where you live, unless there is an extreme situation occurring, for the most part, population will increase. Now, there have been a lot of concerns about post-industrial nations where populations are decreasing and such, and this can be explained through a variety of factors. From a sociological standpoint, it's actually not too uncommon to see a population decline happen within a post-industrial society in which the population grows older. Again, this can be explained by a variety of factors, some of which include medical advancements allowing for people to live longer, various social and public policies that may limit people's desire to have children, access to contraceptives so they don't have to produce nearly as many children, or there could be philosophical and ideological leanings that point towards particular things like, oh, I don't know, removing things like affordable housing. So, the point is, there's going to always be a minimum continuous baseline of development. And if it doesn't exist, then you're only going to be crippling your population at the expense of getting a few landowners rich. I think they have a word for this. It's called aristocracy. The people who are landowners in this case would be the aristocracy, the landed elite. Yes, this is actually what an aristocrat is, fun fact. So, as property values increase, those who have larger amounts of property will gain more in their return. Those who have less or none will gain nothing and have a harder entry into the market, or even a harder entry into getting any sort of housing whatsoever. And thus, you grind everything to a halt. You have an aging populace, a declining population because they have to move out because there's no place for them to live. And thus you get a serious crisis on your hand. So, why affordable housing? Because people need a place to live. The meek shall inherit the earth. And for fuck's sake, do you want to solve the homeless problem or not? Anywho, let's get into the second part here that we were discussing earlier in the introduction and go with a particular affordable housing measure that is going to be on the ballot for the state of Colorado coming up this November. So, Proposition 13 proposes amending the Colorado statutes to set 1. Set aside a portion of annual state income tax revenue for affordable housing programs. 2. Exempt that money from the state's revenue limit, thereby reducing the amount of money collected above the limit that is returned to taxpayers. And 3. Establish eligible uses for this money. So, to first explain some things, in the state of Colorado, we have this thing within the Constitution that's effectively known as TABOR. TABOR is a thing that limits the amount of tax that can be collected by the state in order to be used for the state budget yearly, with any excess being returned to the taxpayers. Now, the year before last year, taxpayers got back about $5. This year, however, due to returned COVID funds, unused COVID funds and all that, and effective and efficient uses of the budget, taxpayers this year got back $750 as a dividend. Which, it's kind of hard to complain too much about that, but at the same time, a lot of those tax dollars could also be going towards things like, well, as this ballot proposal suggests, affordable housing. And if you remember correctly, point number 3 actually hits on a thing we had with land value tax, in which there was an establishing eligible uses with money for things that came up as an excess for land value. This is not quite the same. See, this would just be taking the extra income and trying to find an additional use for it instead of freeing it back to the taxpayers, but rather put it into a different thing within the state's budget as a whole, and thus give it a means of trying to get around the whole TABOR initiative, which limits the overall use of state money. Now, some might argue that this is not necessarily a good thing and that money rightfully belongs back to the taxpayers. Others would argue that this money could be used to put back into public funding, into things that would actually help people as a whole, like public transit and things like that. In fact, we recently actually had a free month on our public transit because of this kind of thing. So, what a vote would do. A yes vote on this proposition sets aside the money for new affordable housing programs and exempts this money from the state's revenue limit. Therefore, it would not apply to TABOR, and this money could be used freely to continue building affordable housing programs. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? No. A no vote on Proposition 123 means state revenue will continue to be spent on priorities as determined by the state legislature or returned to taxpayers as under current law. Now, you can see that, on the one hand, getting $750 back for my income taxes for the state is fucking amazing. It's kind of hard to argue that, isn't it? On the other hand, as someone who likes the idea of having some place for everyone to live, this is sounding like some pretty good jelly in these donuts. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. What exactly does the measure do? The measure sets aside a portion of annual income tax revenue from the state general fund, up to 0.1% of taxable income each year for affordable housing programs administered by the State Office of Economic Development and International Trade, and the Colorado Department of Local Affairs. This amount, which the measure exempts from the state's constitutional revenue limit, is estimated to be $145 million in the state budget year 2022-2023, and $290 million in state budget year 2023-2024 and beyond. The measure specifies the uses for the dedicated funds, including grants and loans to local governments and nonprofit organizations to acquire and preserve land for affordable housing development, assistance to develop affordable multifamily rental housing, equity investments in affordable housing projects, including a program to share home equity with tenants, homeownership programs and down payment assistance for first-time homebuyers, a program addressing homelessness through rental assistance and eviction defense, and grants to increase the capacity of local government planning departments. Sorry, I got a little bit of a dry throat here. The measure that requires that this funding add to and not replace existing state funds spent on affordable housing. And the bill's definition of affordable housing, because legally you have to define that. The measure defines affordable housing based on two factors: household income and housing costs. For certain programs, a household's income is compared to the area median income, or the midpoint of what households in a specific area earn. As defined in the measure, affordable housing means housing for renters making up to 60% of the area median income, or homeowners making up 100% of the area median income. Some of the new programs may benefit households at higher income levels. Table 1 shows examples of area median income for several areas in Colorado. For example, Boulder County, where Boulder and the University of Colorado are located, the median income is about $125,400, with 60% of that being $75,200. It shows examples for other areas. For example, our area in Denver, Aurora, Lakewood, the median income is about $117,800. 60% of that is $70,700. Fun fact, this host doesn't make either of those. For a housing unit or project to qualify as affordable housing, housing costs must not exceed 30% of the household's income. Housing costs typically consist of rent or mortgage payments, but may include other costs such as utilities. So, what is the state currently doing to support affordable housing? The state partners with local communities to increase or preserve Colorado's affordable housing stock, manage rental assistance vouchers, and address homelessness. And the DOLA serves households with varied income levels and circumstances with grants and loans to provide developers, community organizations, public housing authorities, and local governments with money to acquire, modernize, and build housing, and to assist buyers with down payments for homes. The current budget for the Department's affordable housing initiatives is about $200 million, about half of which is from state sources, with the rest coming from federal sources. Since 2021, the state has allocated over $1.2 billion from the Federal American Rescue Plan Act for 2021 for affordable housing and services that address housing insecurity, lack of affordable and workforce housing, or homelessness. These are one-time funds that will be spent on the next several years, specifically on emergency rental assistance, homeowner mortgage assistance, tax credits for developers, housing and infrastructure, and other housing solutions such as manufactured homes. For those of you who may not know, a manufactured home is very similar to a mobile home. Not quite the same, but pretty much the same. The measure creates the following programs with a focus on higher density, environmentally sustainable projects serving households with a range of income levels. For projects of quality or funding, the local governments where projects are located must commit to increasing affordable housing by 3% each year and create a fast-track approval process for affordable housing projects. If a local government chooses not to meet these requirements or fails to achieve its affordable housing goals, projects in that municipality or county will be temporarily ineligible for funding from these programs. Basically, if you want the funding from these programs, you gotta commit to the 3% of affordable housing. And we can go into the various programs here on another table, but for the sake of time, we're gonna skip past that, because I could see most people not outside the state of Colorado not really caring too much about the little nitty-gritty details. If you want, though, we can leave that later. Just leave us any comments or anything like that, and we can give that additional information as upon request. So, how does the measure affect Tabor refunds? The income tax revenue that is set aside under the measure is considered a voter-approved revenue change and therefore is not subject to the state's constitutional revenue limit, also called the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights Tabor limit. You know what's a fun fact? As a new taxpayer, I never got to agree on these Bill of Rights. They just kind of existed. Tabor limits state's government revenue to an amount adjusted annually for inflation and population growth. Revenue collected under the limit may be spent or saved. Revenue collected over the limit must be returned to taxpayers unless voters approve a measure allowing government to keep it. In the years where state revenue exceeds the Tabor limit, the measure reduces the money returned to taxpayers by the amount of income tax revenue that the measure allows the state to keep. In years where the state revenue is below the Tabor limit, the measure does not impact Tabor refunds, but may reduce the amount of money available for the rest of the state budget. In this case, the measure allows the state legislature to reduce part of the new funding for the affordable housing programs to balance the state budget. The state currently expects to return money collected above the limit through at least the 2023-2024 budget year. Whew. So that is some fun little information. And there are definitely parts of that we like. And it definitely sounds like a very good groundwork for an affordable housing program that we'd want to include within our whole land value tax plan. Why? Because it still accounts for the needs of the taxpayers and the individuals. Some of the things I would change on this is, instead of going based on income, establish a land value tax, maybe even eliminate property tax as a counterbalance and use the same percentage rate at first. Land values will still increase and therefore it should still help, plus it'll reduce the overall amount people are paying and thus have to reduce the price at least a little bit of housing currently. It of course wouldn't be a permanent change, it would just be a temporary decrease in pricing, but it would at least help gain something further out of that. And not only that, but a land value tax would have absolutely no connection to Tabor. But that's not exactly something other states have to deal with either. So, some arguments for. Sorry about that. 1. The measure creates a source of funds to tackle housing crisis without raising tax rates and gives local communities the flexibility to respond to their specific needs. State and local governments are not doing enough to keep Colorado affordable. Agreed. Colorado's housing prices make it too hard for many households to afford rent or buy their own home. The new programs help Coloradans participate in the housing market now and in the future. Creating more homes will allow residents and essential workers to remain in their communities. Absolutely agree. So, what are some arguments against? I think you already know our position, but we're gonna let these arguments against because it's only fair. Many of these programs do not address the underlying causes of high housing costs. Pumping money into the market may distort it further, and the real beneficiaries will be landlords and housing developers. This is neither the role of government nor the best use of public resources. There is some truth to that argument, especially the part where it'd be paying land developers and groups like that in order to acquire land and build affordable housing programs. However, if these affordable housing programs are set to a specific limit, then it might not necessarily be a bad thing. For example, in Boulder, there is a whole affordable housing program that limits the overall value that a house can have if it falls under this particular affordable housing program. So, there is some benefit to the individuals. Putting money further into this to help out people of lower incomes, though, isn't necessarily a bad thing. Now, to address the whole landlords issue, well, we kind of got a thought on that. So, in order to help address the landlord issue, this would be a part of our overall land value tax initiative package. Well, one thing you'd have to do is change what the landlord is. Now, as of current, landlords are people who own property and rent it out to others to use for housing and things like that. However, what if it were different? What if we had a cooperative ownership of land title? So there weren't landowners, but land stewards. And thus land wasn't something you owned, but presided over. And that's why we'd include the idea of changing it from an income tax to a land value tax. 2. The measure is unnecessary and will reduce Coloradans to future Tabor refunds. Weak argument so far. The state already provides resources to support affordable housing, including over $1 billion of federal stimulus funds allocated in recent years. The measure diverts money away from the state's budgeting process, money that goes towards priorities as determined by the legislature through deliberation and consultation with stakeholders and constituents, and instead sets aside money in a fund with fixed uses. I'm not gonna lie. To me, that's a pretty damn weak argument. Like, I can see that being a strong argument for others, and particularly if you're one of the right wing or benefit immensely from the Tabor refund, which odds are you don't. Except for this most recent one, because I'm not gonna lie, this was the exception, not the norm. The Tabor refund is usually somewhere around like $4 or $5. Honestly, oftentimes it's not even worth the paper it's printed on. This year was largely an exception because of things like unused COVID funds and things like that. So, keep in mind that yes, it would limit that, but on the other hand, we don't really get a whole lot from that anyway. Not gonna lie, it's only in the past 2 years that I've been able to collect any sort of Tabor funds because the state is using the money in a very limited capacity because it's limited by Tabor. In fact, there are many people who argue that Tabor should be eliminated within this state, and there's a strong movement going on to try to eliminate it. Hasn't succeeded so far, but it's working on it. Anyways, to sum up, it's a pretty good proposal. Personally, I'm definitely endorsing it. Would like some couple things changed, but that's going to require some changes down the road with other things in order to put forward a greater overall affordable housing package, especially when we discussed earlier in our earlier episodes. I believe our Ideology of the Month, Geoism, discusses it a little bit, and we have a couple other episodes, I can't remember the titles right offhand, that are themed around. But yeah, that's pretty much what we got for you. It's a good affordable housing program. We're probably going to be pushing forward for it. We'd like to change it so that there's a land value tax introduced and possibly even remove property tax as a result, and then have it be funded through that land value tax, which would honestly probably be the best way to go about it. But, you know, small steps. And if our plans for 2024 are what we think they're going to be, well, maybe we might get that ability soon to take our shot at it. Anyways, if you've made it to this point, thank you for listening. It's been a rather fascinating one and didn't expect to have my throat go out almost about halfway through, but we got through it. Anyways, if you liked it, hate it, share it. Either way, please share us. We just want to get our ideas and thoughts out there, whether you like them or not. I mean, there are a lot of people who do that anyway, whether you want to hear it or not. At least we're giving you the option here. And those who wish not to be tread on should mind where they step. Have a great night and a pleasant tomorrow.